Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Contingent Agencies Cross-Disciplinary Symposium. I'm Alex Arteaga, and we are, but people that are following us through YouTube maybe don't know, we are at the Zentrum Fokus Forschung from the University of Applied Arts Vienna. Contingent Agencies is an artistic research project conceived by Nikolaus Ganserer and myself in order to inquire into the relationship between agencies and atmospheres. I'm pleased to welcome you here on site, and also all of those of you who are following us online. I'm delighted too to welcome Lambros Malafouris. Yesterday we enjoyed Tim Ingold's lecture, which you can recover in the YouTube channel of the University of the Arts of Applied Arts Vienna. And today we're thrilled to attend Lambros Malafouris' lecture. Lambros Malafouris is, if I might say, an archaeologist dealing with the archaeology of mind, creativity, cognition and material culture, anthropological archaeology, the anthropology of making, the human becoming, and the material engagement theory. Echoing, at least structurally, Rolf Pfeiffer's How the Body Shapes the Way We Think, and more clearly Sean Gallagher's How the Body Shapes the Mind, Malafouris' book, How Things Shapes the Mind, the Theory of Material Entanglement, summarizes his attempts to specify the ways in which an extended mind is informed by its realization beyond human bodies. We have invited Lambros Malafouris to help us to better understand the concept of agency, and more particularly, how agencies distributed beyond the boundaries of the living systems can be conceived. Our research project, Contingent Agencies, departs from the idea that the agencies of non-living entities enable and constrain the emergence of atmospheres. I'm convinced that Lambros Malafouris' lecture entitled Thinking as Thinking will significantly contribute to understand how material agencies shape the atmospheres we inhabit. Please join me in welcoming Lambros Malafouris.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Alex, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Nikolaus, and thanks to the whole group. Those 2 days have been really productive and very interesting, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. So, it is often claimed, both by researchers and skilled practitioners, that making is a dialogue between maker and material. This statement seems to capture a basic characteristic of making as a relational process. But what does it mean? What kind of dialogue is that? The trouble here is that in this presumed dialogical interaction between the maker and the material, no one is actually talking to each other. Acts of making are famous for how little use they make of language. If there is indeed a dialogue, it is not verbal. It makes no use of words. Any true conversation between maker and material must be expressed through different sensory modalities. Sound and hearing, visual resonance, feel, touch, and tactility are some of the prominent candidates. For instance, One may see the foundation of this dialogue in the capacity for attentive listening. Or one could follow the anthropologist Tim Ingle, who was speaking last evening, and see making as a process of correspondence in which sentient practitioners and active materials continually answer to one another in the generation of form. In this lecture, drawing primarily on my ongoing anthropological study of pottery making in Greece, I will attempt to clarify and, if possible, to demystify the meaning of this powerful metaphor of a dialogue between maker and material. I will try to show how a focus on the temporality of touch and the tactility of making can help us disambiguate this non-discursive dialogue and the contingent agencies that come with it. I will follow the ways of the hand as it moves with clay and ask about the agency and experience of touch, what touching does, who is doing the touching, what is touched and how it is touched. My basic proposal is the following. With increasing levels of skill, tactile perception plays an active role in transforming a mere kinetic interaction between potter and clay into a multimodal kinesthetic transaction. In the former case, that of kinetic interaction, potter and clay causally respond to each other. In the latter case, that of kinesthetic transaction, the potter becomes attentive to the expressive affordances of clay, and recursively, the clay becomes responsive to the creative affordances of the potter's hand. I call this situational attunement between the potter and clay haptic attentive unity. I will suggest and discuss later on two major ways that haptic attentive unity can be understood. But first, a brief note on my methodology. The approach we adopt in the Handmade project to study the process of making is multimodal and comparative. We employ and develop a process-oriented methodology called perspectival kinesthetic imaging. Perspectival kinesthetic imaging is a method designed to facilitate the anthropological study of craft through the assemblage and juxtaposition of multitude viewpoints on the process of making. This perspectival juxtaposition is made possible by a combination of multimodal visual captures, for instance, photography, video, drawing, and mobile eye tracking. Each of these multimodal visual captures affords a distinctive perspective from which to identify and observe events of interest, or what we call creative gestures. Multimodal visual captures are set and employed in the context of a multi-sited participant observation, which is the core methodology of anthropological research. Moreover, we incorporate phenomenological interviewing combined with photo and video elicitation, as well as interaction and semiotic analysis. Our study follows, at a theoretical level, the principles of material engagement theory, which proposes a radical continuity between thinking and making. The material engagement approach can be described by means of three major working hypotheses, each one targeting a different but complementary aspect of human becoming, namely cognition, signification, and agency. So we have the hypothesis of the extended mind, which basically argues that many processes that we tend to classify as cognitive or mental and prefer to localize inside the head are better described as distributed processes extending beyond the individual into the socio-material environment. An active signification essentially proposes that the meaning of things is not the product of symbolic representation, but of an action. Material signs bring forth rather than simply represent preformed concepts. And last, the hypothesis of material agency, which basically states that agency is not a human property, but the emergent product of situated activity. What an entity is in itself does not really matter. What does matter is what it becomes and where it stands inside a community of action and material engagement. So from the perspective of material engagement theory, thinking is in the making, or else making is a form of thinking. Mind and matter form a unity. Keeping this theoretical background in mind, I will turn now to haptic attentive unity and the dialogue and agency I mentioned before in between potter and clay. When potters are asked to describe clay or the relation with this material, expressions like clay is alive, I become one with clay, and clay speaks to me are very common. Ceramists are not alone in doing this, namely in seeing life and agency where other people cannot. It is common for the skilled craftsperson to perceive the animate qualities and creative habits of the tools and materials that define their practices and skills. Different crafts and materials have their own affordances and morphogenetic potentials, as well as capacities for expression and communication. Of course, the potter's descriptions and subjective self-assessments about the experience of making and the qualities of clay cannot be taken at face value. As every anthropologist and social theorist knows well, expressions like clay is alive or clay talks to me do not carry analytical conviction as such. They do not constitute theoretical descriptions or explanations of why clay moves or behaves the way it does. Still, these sentences do represent how the people who actually work with clay and know it better choose to speak about their experiences, so they should not be dismissed as merely things people say. As I came to know firsthand, working for many years and with many potters, these are the people who know clay from the inside, which means that clay is part of what they are. They are both skilled makers and concerned observers who spend their life constantly learning and experiencing the plasticity of this material. This does not mean, however, that the potter's explanations are necessarily the best explanations, or that there is a simple way to separate one description as being more accurate than another. The potters often see distinctions where others see continuity, and continuity where others see difference. They often unite things that our analytical predispositions may wish to keep separate, but they may also divide things that we seek to unite in our analysis. Naturally, neither the potter nor the anthropologist in themselves have the final authority to decide what is best description or interpretation of the life, agency, or language of clay. Instead, they are both partners in an exploratory process in which they combine skills and exchange knowledge and ways of seeing. Participatory analysis and methodologies like that of kinesthetic imaging we employ at the Handmade Project are the products of this synergy of technical and analytical perspectives. Once that move is made, and as I'll explain in a moment some of the theoretical preconditions for that, it becomes clear that the proposed life of clay is not a matter of metaphorical language or of a misattribution of agency. On the contrary, is the product of education of attention and attentive material engagement. So to give you one specific example, when the two potters that you see depicted in the slide, namely Kostas the Pastas and Antonis Achonios from the island of Sifnos, describe the Sifnian clay as alive, they do not simply use a figure of speech in order to add emphasis to their narrative, nor do they, as some psychologists are inclined to believe when confronted with similar animistic behaviors, misuse the human capacity for social intelligence, projecting life and agency to something that has clearly none, namely clay. If the potters in our example come to think that the clay is alive, is not because they somehow are childishly misguided to animate matter. Rather, their ability to experience the animacy of clay is simply the product of their increased sensitivity and responsiveness to the affordances of this material, to the affordances of clay. It is that feeling of and for clay that allows them also sometimes to imagine for real, to quote a phrase from Tim Ingles' new book that was speaking yesterday. The more skilled the potters become, the more possibilities for the generation of form and material imagination will be forced upon their attention. The active use of animate language serves to emphasize this vitality and multimodality of clay. Whatever term one may use to describe the exchange of energies between potter and clay, it cannot be one that presupposes subjects and objects. Rather, it has to be one that expresses their mutual becoming in form making. Centering clay on the wheel is recognizably the most basic and difficult techniques in pottery making. It is the foundation for throwing and for making. It essentially involves the skilled positioning of clay in between two major forces, the kinetic force of the spinning wheel and the kinesthetic force of the potter's hands. The success of centering will facilitate or limit the creative transaction between the potter and clay. There are two major ways to describe and account for that process. The one we may call representational or interactional, and the second we may call performative transactional. Put it simply, the main difference between the two accounts is the following. According to the representational interactional account of centering, it is the potter who is attuning his or her body with the clay. By contrast, according to the performative transactional account, it is the act of centering that is attuning the potter's body with the clay. I advocate for the primacy of material engagement and thus for the latter view. But let us take a closer look on what both views actually imply. Let's begin with the representational or interactional view. The obvious way to describe what's happening during centering is to look at it as a causal, sequential interaction between potter and clay. This description conveniently presupposes the existence of two well-defined and separate entities, namely potter and the clay. These two entities, one active and the other passive, are given in advance of the creative process and are interacting only during the actual process of making when the potter is acting on clay. This implies a clear direction of causality, namely action is caused by the potter's brain or body as a succession of isolated moments in time. The separation of the potter from clay, of the subject from the object, also answers, at a basic level, the question of agency, namely, who is the author of the doing? Clearly, on that consuel, it must be the potter who imposes form on clay. This is, of course, an oversimplified version of a more complicated and heavily contested story of creative agency. Still, the underlying message, or ontology if you prefer, is clear. Thinking takes place inside the head and simply uses the hand of the potter to execute the necessary movements that will allow the mind to act on matter. Sensible and intuitive, this representational description as it may seem, we have good reasons to suggest that it is not the most accurate way to describe the coming together of potter and clay. The discussed representational account, although well embedded in the dominant cognitivist ontology of contemporary psychology and cognitive science, fails to explain and misrepresents what happens when our potters engage with clay. Two major and related shortcomings are especially relevant to my argument here. First, the misrepresentation of temporality, in the sense of duration, as chronology. And second, the misrepresentation of hylonoetic. The term hylonoetic comes from the Greek word heli for matter and noises for intelligence. So we have the misrepresentation of hylonoetic consciousness as mere bodily subjectivity. Taken together, those major shortcomings are responsible for misconceiving the temporal co-constitution of potter and clay for a mere sequential causal interaction between them. Which brings us to the second performative transactional view of centering I mentioned before. Look at the gestures depicted in this slide. Although they may seem to represent sequential phases in the making of the pot, they are by no means discrete or separated. Creative gestures do not just follow one another in time. Rather, it is carried over the next as a path of movement along a line of clay. In other words, the temporality of pottery making is durational. As was pointed out, the basic contribution of centering in pottery making is to establish the necessary material ecology which will allow the aims, intentions, or plans of the potter to align with the agency and affordances of the materials and the tools involved. The success of making as an emergent performance depends on that basic purposeful alignment that the act of centering makes possible. In this connection, an important point about centering that I wish to highlight, as it is often is being misrepresented, is the following. It is not the potter that is centering the clay. Rather, it is the process of centering that allows the movements of the potter, the clay, and the wheel to form a temporal alliance, establishing the possibility of a meaningful dialogue. This is also why centering, at least a successful one, implies an odd sense of decentering. In particular, the centering of clay necessitates the decentering of the potter's bodily subjectivity. This explains why potters often describe pottery making as a struggle to become one with clay. Touching clay, the potter's hand calls into question the dualisms of mind and matter. The common distinction between the knower and known collapse. In the context of material engagement theory, this mode of thinking is referred to as thinking. I use the notion of thinking to articulate the process of thinking and feeling with, through, and material things. As some of you may know, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his famous essay, The Thing, uses the same term, namely thinking, to express how things gather space and time. My own use of the term thinking retains this original sense of gathering, but I also somehow diverge from the Heideggerian phenomenological path, emphasizing instead the agency of things in human thinking, or else what I call the cognitive life of things. In any case, the basic premise that I want to communicate through the notion of thinking is quite simple. We humans are thinkers. No other animal has been or can be defined as a species on the basis of its relationship with a variety of things and material forms that it makes. We humans are precisely a species of this rather strange sort. Let me explain. I say we are strange not because I deny that other animals are capable of thinking. We know that they are. Nor do I say we are strange because I believe that by making things and by thinking through things, we overcome the limits of our nature and enter into a separate cultural realm. No other controversy in the study of human becoming has been more unhelpful, misleading, and sterile than that between what we call nature and culture. There is no moment in the history of human evolution where biology gave way to culture. Human becoming has always been inseparably linked with the developmental contingencies of action. No bodily activity, not even our basic capacity for bipedal locomotion, is immune to the situated dynamics of real-life ontogenetic development. As the anthropologist Marcel Mauss neatly pointed out in his famous essay on bodily techniques, there is no natural way to move our bodies. But I suggest it would be equally wrong to think of bodily movement as the mere product of culture. There is no natural or cultural way to move our bodies. Instead, we should think of the acting body as a relational developmental achievement of situated material engagement. For instance, the body of the potter in our example, entering into the craft of pottery making, working with clay, and developing the skills of the job, it becomes more than a body. It becomes situated. What that means is that the body becomes specific and different. It embodies a unique developmental life history. It becomes affected by the physical and psychoactive properties of clay, by the patterns and rhythms of coordination, and by the kinesthetic experiences, muscular memories, and skills attached to it. Unlike other human bodies with no special connection to the art of potting, the potter's body will come to know, with practice and effort, how to touch and feel the clay. The potter's body must be able reliably and in different conditions to identify what kind of actions clay invites or allows, and be able to relate to the properties of this material in a way that other human bodies cannot. This is a dynamical process that involves a temporal alliance of specific skills, materials, gestures, and sequences of action. A common mistake is to see the material elements of practice, for instance, the wheel or the clay, as passive, external influences operating from the outside on the potter's body. In contrast to this separatist view, the material engagement perspective is grounded on the assumption that the relevant material environment becomes incorporated into the body schema, actively operating inside and through the body. I do not mean that in the discontinuous representational sense, but in the continuous enactive sense. It is not the world that is represented on the inside, rather it is the body that is extended on the outside, seeking sources of agency and new paths of self-specification. According to that vision, clay simultaneously is a force of attraction, resistance, and capacity for action. The proposed terminological shift from thinking to thinking help us to escape representationalism and to focus where brain, body, and materiality join forces and exchange properties. Pottery making is now cast in in terms of hylonoetic consciousness and material imagination. Understanding those issues often necessitates a great deal of unlearning of our modern habits of thinking. So to that end, a useful anthropological analogy I would like to propose is that of the gift. Form-making, as I will discuss in a moment in more details, is more of a gifting. But first I would like to focus on the notion of haptic attentive unity I mentioned at the beginning. As explained, I adhere to that ecological and active tradition of thought which holds that the study of making demands an approach which situates skilled practice in the context of material engagement. This is also to recognize the process of making as an attentive transaction with the tools and materials involved. This transaction, which is often described both as a dialogue between the potter and clay and as the unifying experience of becoming one with the clay, is multimodal. Although I emphasize the tactility of making, it needs to be underlined that the state of situational attunement I called haptic attentive unity is cross-modal and extends beyond the point of contact of the hand with the clay. The haptic attentive unity and the related experience of attentive engagement refers to the whole body in movement with its ways of touching and feeling the clay. A good example of that can be seen in this slide, which shows the difference between the visual and the tactile foci of somatic attention during throwing. Very often, in the case of making, it is vision that works on a par with touch, rather than touch that works on a par with vision. Like in the case of the blind person with a stick, it is sight that is put in the service of touch. The eye is touching the surface of clay. It is touch, of course, that provides most information about material composition, texture, weight, or temperature. The haptic attentive unity expresses the integration of these attentive modes. In particular, there are two major ways that haptic attentive unity can be understood. First, haptic attentive unity denotes the feeling of mindful presence characteristic of attentive engagement, where the potter's attention is fully absorbed in the action. Second, haptic attentive unity is also associated with the active exploratory use of touch in the handling of clay. That is, the use of touch as a tool of creative material engagement. I will focus on the latter. The relation between haptic attentive unity and creative material engagement can be understood as follows. Many times during the process of making, clay is not the object of the potter's tactual experience, but the very medium of an active discovery. Although clay is the material touched by the potter's hand, in specific occurrences of exploratory activity, clay can also be understood as a transparent glove or a prosthetic tool that the potter is actively using in order to perceive and discover. That is, rather than seeing clay as merely providing the content of the potter's tactual experience or perception, clay now becomes a kind of second skin to touch with. The potter senses through this globe of clay the possible contours of a form. The material is the prosthesis. The potter's hand then uses and touches the clay, and at the same time is used and is touched by the clay. Clay is no longer the passive material upon which form is imposed, rather it is an active tool with which the potter perceives, anticipates, imagines, explores, and discovers possibilities of form. And that is the agency of this material. The clay is for the potter what the stick is for the blind. Clay is not the object, but the medium of the potter's perception. I suggested that the making of form depends on a haptic exchange between the potter and the relevant material environment. I would like now to explore the meaning of this exchange further, as it can help us understand the dialogical aspect of making. Drawing on Merleau-Ponty's famous example of one hand touching the other, the relationship between the hand and clay could be described as being reversible. What that means is that clay perceives the potter's hand as much as the potter perceives clay. But how can clay perceive anything? No doubt, clay forming is a good example of tactual perception or haptic touch. Most researchers would agree that touch is simultaneously active and passive. One cannot touch without being touched. Touching the clay also means being touched by the clay. We all can touch clay. And we all can, to some extent, imagine that we touch clay. But to claim that the clay is actually touching us seems like a step too far. And yet, this is exactly what I would like to suggest. This rare and rather special occurrence where the clay is actually touching the potter's hand is precisely what seems to be the distinctive feature of haptic attentive unity. What does this mean? The problem is partly perspectival and partly transactional. As such, its theoretical transposition into the anthropological language of exchange may help us to understand and perhaps to resolve it. I have suggested that haptic attentive unity to the extent that is grounded on multimodal exchanges and transactions, resembles a form of gifting. The notion of gift and the process of gifting, or gift exchange, that is to give, to receive, and most importantly, to reciprocate, is well studied and seem of particular relevance, not the least because of Moses' influential account of the Maori notion of how, the so-called spirit of the gift. What I essentially proposed is that attentive material engagement resembles in its operation that of gift exchange. I suggest that attention is a gift, that attentiveness is a gifting. To be attentive is to anticipate some form of reciprocation. The notion of attentive material engagement and its culmination in haptic attentive unity motivates the same question that guided the anthropologist Marcel Mauss in his original analysis of the gift in the Tobrian Islands, and can be expressed by the question, what force is there in the attention given that makes the recipient give something back? What I borrow from the language of the gift is a way to express the entanglements of attention for which we often lack the vocabulary. Moses' account of the Maori notion of how, as presented in his famous essay, The Gift, speaks also of an intermingling of person and thing. I suggest that as the Maussian characterization of the spiritual power of the gift is situated in the absence of an absolute differentiation between persons and things, so the attentive power of touch is situated in the absence of an absolute differentiation between the touching and the touched. Of course, gifts are not always reciprocal and necessarily alignable. That is true also for the gift of attention and its complex political economy that I will not be discussing here. The question is this: what force is there in the potter's creative gesture which compels the recipient, namely clay, to make a return, namely to generate form? I propose that in the case of attention gifts, the gift returns in the form of situational affordances and an active discovery. Technically, this is what we described before as immersive attentive engagement. Attentiveness, or some forms of it, are inalienable possessions which can never be fully removed from the person who originally owned them. Of course, the meaning of ownership is not very clear in this context. We said that touch is generally understood as the property of the potter's hand. Touching belongs to the hand like seeing belongs to the eye. But this is not entirely true. Body ownership in the case of the potter, as in all cases of creative thinking, is negotiable and dissociable from agency. The sense of agency, namely the sense that I am causing my hand to move, and the sense of ownership, namely the sense that it is my hand that is moving, are far from stable during the process of creation and are completely transformed during the experience of haptic attentive unity. Touch plays a crucial role here. Attention, agency, and ownership are parts of a gift exchange between potter and clay. In the case of making or creative material engagement, the equivalent of the gift is form. Form is the gift that travels, or the object of exchange between potter and clay. The haptic attentive unity of clay is the force that sustains this exchange, the force of attentive material engagement. So to conclude, it has long been recognized, notably by Leroy, the anthropologist Leroy Guérin, in his famous book Gesture and Speech, that the making of anything, and I quote, is a dialogue between the maker and the material employed. Clay forms, perhaps more than other material forms, are seen as embodiments of this dialectical process, or as the products of such a dialogue. There is a paradox here, but also the solution of it. The paradox is that, with the possible exception of learning, skilled practices and their creations make little use of language. I don't mean that creation is mute, silent, or meaningless. Instead, what I have tried to show is that the creative transactions between makers and materials exceed the confines of a linguistically based notion of dialogue. The notion of dialogue, in the linguistically based meaning of the term, presupposes separate and identifiable voices with the capacity to occupy different positions and roles. However, in the context of creative material engagement, such positioning merges into a single voice of becoming and culminates in the haptic attentive unity of potter and clay. The language of clay is tactile rather than verbal. The dialogue between the potter and clay is based on haptic transactions, gestures, and movements. The potter needs to touch clay in a way that will elicit a response from it that will, in turn, elicit a further response of the potter. Knowing how to touch clay is relatively easy. Knowing how to transact with clay is altogether a different challenge. During those tactile dialogic encounters, clay responds to touch like humans do. Actualizing this tactile mode of communication takes years to learn. Yet it is this affective interconnectedness between the maker and material that makes skilled practices capable of speaking in the absence of language. This is also how I understand the meaning of material agency. Not as a fixed capacity that a person or a thing has, but as the product of this situated and mediated action. I would like to end here, and I would like just for 6 minutes to show you a short film which will help you understand a bit better of the context of our project. The film was produced and created by Maria Danai-Kukuti, who is a research assistant in the project. And I hope you'll just give me a minute to sort this out.
Yeah, that would be really good.
Okay.
Με πιο μετάλλικο φωτό μπορεί να είναι πάνω από έξω η ματιά.
Τα πάντα ξεκινάνε έτσι. Τα πάντα. Τώρα όμως πρέπει, εδώ είναι το σοβαρότερο τώρα, να πιάσω μισοδακτυλιά. Εδώ. Η μεγάλη τέχνη εδώ. Τώρα θα το στενοκολλιάσω. Τώρα το στενοκόλλιασα. Και τελειώνει εδώ.
Ένας σωλήνας, ο οποίος από κάτω έχει το σχήμα που θέλεις να δώσεις.
Δεν ήταν άνθρωπος που δούλευε στη γη, όπως ο πατέρας μου δούλευε μέχρι... Ήταν πιο αδύναμος, πιο...
head. So the head is going one way and the two arms were going like that. So that was quite interesting.
Το μεγάλο παιδί, έτσι.
Το μεγάλο.
Ναι, ναι.
Εδώ που εφίδρωσα.
Ναι, εδώ κοιτάς πολύ, είναι κάποια πράγματα που προσέχει.
Η πεθερά μου έξω εδώ καθάριζε ψάρια και μετά όταν παντρεύτηκα μου λέει ποια είπε ότι είχε δίκιο. Δηλαδή, και είπα την αλήθεια, δηλαδή, ότι εγώ ήμουν.
Αυτό που θα φτιάξω τώρα θέλω να είναι το πιο ωραίο από όλα που έχω κάνει στη ζωή μου.
Αυτό πάντα το λέτε.
Πάντα. Αυτό που θα πάω να φτιάξω τώρα θέλω να είναι το πιο ωραίο που έχω φτιάξει στη ζωή μου. Δεν ευχαριστιέμαι τώρα που κάθομαι. Θέλω να φτιάχνω.
Very much.
We thank you very much for this amazing, extremely dense, inspiring lecture. I'm sure there are plenty of questions waiting to be expressed, so I will be pleased to provide the medium to express them. Who wants to break the ice today? Yeah. Paula Kramer.
I wanted to hear a little bit more on this attentiveness that you were speaking about at the very end. It made me think of, I mean, we're in a working process here, and we were working before, and I was working with movement and thinking exactly about that. Like, what is a kind of attentiveness and attention that allows an emergence? And so I feel like many of the things that you've argued and said are very, very familiar to me. But this, just this turn at the end towards attention, I would be really happy to hear a little bit more on, I don't know how you came to think of attention, or how you think of attention and attentiveness, and what you think it does. And maybe it's a little bit of a repetition and making broader what you've already said. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in some way, attention has been a central aspect of the lecture today. I introduced this notion of haptic attentive unity, which I found very useful to think about when it comes to skilled practices, like the example of pottery making. That was the central, that is the main, if you want, object of my study in recent years. Of course, you could think of attention in all kinds of different skilled practices. It's not just pottery making. And you could think of attention also in many different levels. I'm focusing on the kind of attentiveness that allows, in this example, the potter to come into contact with clay in a way that could be described with this notion of a dialogue that we use. I think attentiveness is the necessary quality for this dialogue. That was the main argument I was trying to make here. And it's not something simple. It's not just happening. Yes, it's not easy to quantify attention. Qualify, yes. Well, there are different kinds of attention. The one I try to describe is a deep, immersive attentiveness, the kind that you can develop only after years of practice and commitment to what you do. Perhaps it's not even an issue of time, it's more of how you commit yourself to what you do to your surrounding and environment. We can think of attention in all kinds of different ways, and there is a whole socio-political side into it. I mean, attention is a precious commodity these days, and society has demands on your attention. Advertising is demanding your attention. Everybody do something to draw your attention. And at the same time, we perhaps find ourselves paying attention to their own kind of things rather than to the ones we should. There is a deep connection with time and temporality also, because attention has this unique, if you want, duration or this unique ability to transform the experience of time. You could be lost in time because of this attentiveness, but at the same time you can develop this mindful presence in time, which is also characteristic of skilled practices and perhaps goes beyond mere skilled practices. So attention is something I feel very important. It's part of our everyday life and living, but it also has certain qualities that you could observe in specific settings better than others. And I have found the study of craft especially very productive in this respect. So this is how I see the qualities of attentiveness. I mean, we had this discussion those days about affect and atmospheres. And I think that attentiveness can have also some role to play in this discussion. So that could be something that we could explore further if we want. Yeah.
Next question is by Emma Cocker.
Yeah, thank you for this lecture. So much to think about. There's three sort of link questions. One is skill always a prerequisite for the attentive material engagement that you describe? And I'm curious whether you think there might be possibilities for attentive material engagement that are not predicated on the basis of skill. Mm-hmm. And then the second question was whether the examples that you show, you kind of, it seemed as if they were real masters of their craft in a sense. And I guess I'm interested in whether there's a level of skill which is simply enoughness, like a level of fluency that enables this transactional or performative transaction. So something around fluency or enoughness rather than mastery. And I guess the third question was to do with this relationship between skill and mastery, because even the term mastery seems so counterintuitive to this performative transactional model that you're proposing, but it seems as if it's so closely interwoven with the notion of skill.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. Well, beginning with your question about skill, there are different skills. So I presented here the skill of pottery making, but not all skills are the same, and they should not be perceived as something that relates necessarily to manual activity or to the kind of crafts that I've discussed. I mean, language is a skill, poetry is a skill. So I would say that attentiveness develops with skill, because skill needs time, and the different levels of skill that will allow you to develop the kind of expertise that is needed. Whatever you do, it doesn't really matter if we are talking about pottery making or something else. I think that skill is the kind of quality that will help you develop those aspects of making, in our case, or performance in other cases, that would allow you to discover affordances and to see things that others cannot. And very often, although I've been working with potters for 15 years, 20 years now, there are still things that they do in front of me which I cannot see. They will let me know that this has happened. This is good, this is not so good. Vision is also an issue of skill. Sound and hearing has to do with skill. Everything relates to skill somehow, and this is how I see this intimate link with attentiveness. Now, yes, I don't think necessarily you need to be an expert. I don't use the word master because it has the wrong kind of connotation. Mastering is a kind of imposition, and I don't think that those people are actually imposing anything on the material. I think they transact with the material, which means that we have this symmetrical, if you want, or if not symmetrical, at least is more democratic relationship with materials. But you definitely need to have developed some level of expertise. Not necessarily, being an expert, but for sure possessing the necessary skill that will now allow you to have this kind of communication, which I feel also explains why we often struggle or have this negative, I think, when we begin to do something and we don't really know how to situate our bodies and what to do and how to hold something. That is always, a bit of, has a kind of negative feeling. And one of the main reasons for that, I think, relates with your inability to attend properly to the material or to the space or to, whatever is relevant material environment in terms of that. I forgot your final question. It was the... Okay, thanks.
Beautiful. And next one is going to be asked by Arno Böhler.
Thank you. So I agree with many analyses, what was very precise, what you made, but still a question popped up for me if we change the material in a certain way, dear said. So, because you made also very general claims that in a certain way you would see in this example a way of changing the classical way we think the relation of matter and mind, for example, in general. But for me, this is a very special example of how we deal with materials. If I take, and there are many different ways of touching, so that is my thing. How can we touch it? So, for example, Jean-Luc Nossi speaks of touche. Yeah? So this is, for example, if two groups are meeting on the road and they are fighting each other, it's a touche. Yeah? It's a touching of different striking groups, which is very different to this way of touching. Or if I go now to a material example, if we have nuclear waste or nuclear material, you know, to touch this material up to a certain way can become very explosive and destructive for us. So is this metaphor of giving, which sounds quite harmonious, also applicable to other things? For example, the giving can be a big blast, yeah? And if you deal with nuclear weapon, can destroy us in a certain way. Therefore, also Deleuze and others said that it can also hit you. Yeah? So it has not just a nice thing of giving, but it can really also hit us. Yeah? Such a way of touching. So how would you think, is this then just another way of touch, or to generalize these things? That was just coming up as a question, yeah, yes, to your analysis.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think that to some extent there are some aspects of what I described I would expect to be similar in different contexts and different materials or situations, but at the same time, like anything else, and I advocate for a situated perspective, meaning that situation matters. And if you change the material, if you change the context, if you change the environment, if you change the practice we are talking about, different things will happen, inevitably. So I do think that attention is important, but I would agree with what you describe as, you know, the return might be different and very often unexpected. That relates to the affordance. I use the term affordance in the ecological psychology view, which is always relational. So it's not just, it's a technical term. And I use the term transaction also in the pragmatic sense, as we found in Dewey, that speaks again about this relationality. I mean, you can call it an interaction if you are into Barrett's, for instance, because he will speak later on. But it's the same thing. So we are, at some point, I describe things in a more abstract level, which could relate with different practices. I mean, I could see attentiveness in the context of music, of a music performance, although it's different from pottery making, or in other instances, which means that I'm expecting difference, and I'm always looking and trying to understand difference as it emerges in different practices. But I can also see a certain interesting and structural similarities that for the kind of work that I do, which is always anthropological, provides me a comparative space. Because my study is comparative. So you observe things and you also compare things. I work, let's say, with 35 different potters. And there are things that they do in a similar way, but there are things that they do in very different ways. And they might express certain things using the same language. In other cases, they tell you exactly the opposite. You have to deal with all that. And what I found really interesting and useful, methodologically useful with pottery making, is the wheel itself and the material, because it constrains things. It's like a kind of ecologically valid experiment. There are certain things that are happening in a way that allows you to compare, to have a meaningful basis for comparison, which is really important, I think, for the kind of work that I'm trying to do. Because I'm not a practitioner, I'm trying to understand the processes and that relate to creativity, that relate to making and skill. So I hope that somehow answered your question.
It's from Andreas Spiegel.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to continue with the last question by Arno in a way, where you would locate this unity in the context, call it, of a socio-political, ecological presence that we are facing now. If you want to describe it shortly, what we call touch screen. So every day we are confronted with the so-called touch screen. I suppose we all would agree saying, so the worst thing to touch is the touch screen. That's completely blind. So it's the kind of blind touching. But you could say the touch screen represents a contemporary culture of touching, means touching disappears. The unity you are describing, and that's why I think Arno's question was also directed a little bit to, let's say, to a different point, to locate the contemporary version of touching nowadays. Because unity means I work with the material, I become the material becomes myself, so one cannot distinct anymore precisely. So they form a unity. But my everyday is based, you can say, practically on the complete opposite, because being confronted with differentiation. I can produce this, I can offer that, but I can't, millions of things, I cannot do them. So I depend on others. This is the point where I not speak about unity anymore, but as a consumer. And if one takes your model to say the consumer is buying a commodity, you can, at the same time, if you exchange them, you can say the consumer is actually produced by the commodity. So the same rhythm, so the maker and the material, you can say the very product produces its consumer. The consumer is consumed by its own consumption. So you can say the logic of the argument is exactly the same. But there we would say, if we call it, this is a different material, because the consumer is designed by the material. And even you would say there are skilled consumers, some who have an expertise in that, and saying, so I have an intention, I'm really skilled. So let's say if you're a skilled consumer, you would say, I try to get those potteries by the expert that you have produced, because I'm a skilled consumer. I do not buy this, I go to that guy, because then I consume at least the image of a unity production, but as consumption. So that means the challenge for me is where to locate your argument for this dissolving distinction of the making of the material and the maker. Where to locate that?
Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to see if I understood correctly your question. The case I presented here makes a clear statement for this unity that develops with different levels of skill and expertise between potter and clay. And your question is, if we take that in a different context, in a broader social, the context of consumption, for instance, what might be some of the implication if we follow this kind of logic? Is that correct? Okay, great. The way I see the modern world as it operates in a modern society is in many ways exactly the opposite. I mean, the kind of attentiveness that is being promoted, if we have any kind of attentiveness, is always mostly of the wrong kind of things. Time is always faster than it should be, and the ability and the opportunity for skill development in all the different ranges is very often absent. And there are all kinds of divisions there, and inequalities also, because it's also an issue of who has access to those kind of skills. I don't think, I mean, one part, perhaps this is also a source of some of our problems, because we create discontinuities all the time between ourselves and the environment, and if you distance yourself from it, then inevitably you will perceive that environment as a resource, as something that It's available to you for whatever use you have in mind, rather than as a partner that you live with and you do certain things with, and you lost this dependency, which is crucial. We are dependent on the surrounding environment and or surrounding social context. And that presupposes the kind of interaction that will bring us together. In a Western context, of course, there is always this self-other distinction. But even through the self-other distinction, you could develop your own relational identity, meaning sometimes difference is useful, the distance is useful for you to define yourself and to evaluate very often the way you relate to your surrounding environment. But again, I feel it's an issue of how we decide what is important for our attention and how much effort, or if you want, attention, we put into those issues. Very often we just, perhaps art, if you come from an art perspective, it might be more difficult to understand the problem. I think art is all about attentiveness. I mean, in my view, artists are always into this mode of, attentive to the kind of things that other people do not really pay so much attention. But I think for society outside the context of the realm of craft and art, very often operates in a kind of distancing and promotes probably exactly the opposite of what I see, of the qualities I see emerging in the context of craft, which I found healthy, to put it this way, more than others. So I'm not sure if I have an answer to your question. I think it's a difficult question, and I don't know what will happen if we are going to follow this kind of craft-based model of social interaction. I think good things can emerge out of it, and I do believe that craft has a strong mental health element to it. I mean, that's good, broadly speaking, but the same applies for all kind of creative activity. And it is those creative activities that very often promote the kind of attentiveness that I tried to describe here. So, yes, this is, I guess, so far as I can go with it.
Yes, thanks. I have a methodological question, and I have the feeling that might relate to what Paula asked earlier about qualifying different modes of attention. When I was looking at the video, so now it's about this perspectival kinesthetic imaging, and you used eye tracking technology. But when I looked at the video, I had the feeling that there was a parallax error. The circle indicating the focus point of the eye was always slightly above the point where I would expect it to be. So first question, were there parallax error? Or if it wasn't a parallax error, is it indicating somehow certain decentralized or peripheric attention that deviates from the kind of expected focused attention?
It's both. In the case of some individuals, for all kind of reasons, you get this kind of mistake, and then you try to understand how that, because that will happen consistently, so that still is a useful indication. In other cases, no, and you have this interesting, if you want, indications of where the eye is, what I call the eye is touching the clay, and where the hand is touching the clay. But the important thing, I guess, methodologically speaking, to clarify, is that the use of eye tracking that we do is very different from the kind of eye tracking that you see in psychology studies. So our interest is very simple. We are trying to follow where the eye is touching the clay, because you can observe where the hand is touching the clay, so you can have all kind of interesting recordings and ways to quantify that. What you don't see ever is where the eye is touching. I'm referring to touching, but there are all kind of reasons why I say that. But we have this line, if you want, that you can follow and you can juxtapose then with the hand. And the interesting thing about the eye tracking is that very often it reveals something that the potters themselves don't know and have never seen. So when we reach the final, the so-called elicitation stage, that works really, really well. Meaning they always have something very interesting to tell you when you ask them why you are focusing, why you look at that part of the vase, whereas you're actually making hand is 30 centimeters below. I mean, and we have all those kind of interesting, if you want, differences in terms of attention between where the hand is attending and touching the clay and where the eye is attending. And then that provides opportunities for a lot of interesting questions and clarifications. So that part has worked really well. Even if it's not always easy to have a very good calibration. I mean, there are issues that relate to the physiology of different people's eye. I mean, some of them were wearing glasses, and that was also complicated the process. But overall, I found it extremely useful, the eye tracking, but not in itself, only in the context of the other dimensions of research. So you have to combine that with the photography, with the videography, with the drawing that we are producing, and of course with the traditional ways of engaging with those people, spending months with them, interviewing them. And if you have this more holistic ecology, then that can be a useful methodological device, especially because it's nowadays mobile, right? It's the eye tracking that you just, like my microphone, you just wear the glasses and you do what you do. So, did that answer your question? Yes, I understand. It's complex. Thank you. But in a way, yes, I mean to say that we have both the mistake that you mentioned, but also sometimes in other cases you have those interesting, differentiations, unexpected sometimes, both for us and for the potters.
Thank you very much for your talk and for writing the book you wrote. I'm a philosopher by training, which is not to praise myself, it's rather to give you an idea of how difficult this is when you come from the from the side of the intelligible. So in this video you showed, I was fascinated by the potter saying that this time I will be making the most beautiful one. Because it was obvious that he doesn't have an intention of making this or that object, so intention falls out. He's giving attention to the clay. Now, I'm working on and developing a notion of guessing. And similarly to, the guesser and the pottery and the pottery made, or the gift and the gifter, when we guess, the guesser and the thing guessed, in a way, have to ontologically merge. I'm trying to develop this account in the sensible and not in the intelligible. But there is exactly the problem you have from the other side. So now, I know that I'm sort of in the intelligible, but I want to argue that it's more a labor of patterning. It's a labor of mustering, of forming when we guess. And so similar to what the potter does with his clay. Now, to close the circle, as your book is about how things shape the mind, it is the suggestion that the activity of the mind is not purely intelligible that I'm making or that I'm asking you. So guessing, or maybe akin to Kant's aesthetic judgment, is then not an activity in the intelligible, but it is a sort of, imaging and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, it partly depends also on how you define guessing. I mean, because when we think about guessing, right, there is, I presume, both the element of anticipation. I mean, you're guessing something by anticipating something, but also prediction. And different theories and different schools of thinking, perhaps, would relate to those two terms in different ways. But I would agree with you that I think that, first of all, it's not an issue of intentionality. It's not what kind of intentions they have. it's above all, I would say, the confidence. They can guess because they are confident that they can do it. And that they have the skill to produce something. So they don't even visualize it. I mean, they know that they can produce certain forms. They can do that, and they just go and do it. There is a kind of guessing, I mean, in the sense of some form of risk-taking, that sometimes you will see that, I mean, things are not going always the way you want them to go. So you should be able to respond to it. And for them, very often, the important thing is the demonstration of their skill rather than the final form. So when they talk about beauty, is the beauty of making, is not the beauty of the final. It's not so much what they will, or what we will see at the end, and whether that is beautiful. Is to do things right, in the right way, to know that they have produced a form that has the qualities they believe are important to demonstrate their skills. And those qualities very often are not visible. I mean, I cannot see from the outside whether the clay itself will perform in the way that they want. What you see is an exterior, but they can sense those things. So they know that the vase they just produced will behave in the right way or in the expected way or not. So there is this kind of guesswork that is more embodied, if you want, rather than intellectual. It's not a kind of, there is thinking going on, but in a more bodily and more an active way rather than in this, if you want, analytical, discursive way. I don't mean to separate the two. I mean that the performative aspect, I feel, is.
And I just try to do a very short comeback because it's late. I think the term guessing always invites this, jump and creativity and so on. But I do mean, a sort of embodied, habituated activity, and I think that exists in thinking as well as, But the fun part is that in thinking, it's not just yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a question from the practice-based discipline. When you're talking about the process of creating, the matter of creating or thinking is a gathering of material that we can touch and that can touch us. Mm-hmm. I was just thinking or wondering if you could say, how do you relate to assemblage and the negative space and the material that is not touchable in that sense as clay are?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. I think this is a challenging question for someone who is not practicing what you just described. And the reason being that, as I said before, in one of my previous answers, there are different kinds of skills. And sometimes touch is an obvious thing. I mean, you can see that it happens, but there are different ways to touch and be touched. Some of those ways are not necessarily the obvious ways, but even when it comes to kind of immersive or digital environment or absent environment that you don't really have an obvious material surface to interact with, to hold it, there are still ways you can sense your environment that could be meaningful from a tactile point of view. So as you move inside the air of that room, there is tactility going on, even if I'm not touching really anything, because if with the right kind of attention and skill, you can feel the air through your hand. So you can touch the air and you can get touched by it. And some people can do that really well for all kinds of reasons. And in that sense, I feel that what you describe can again be linked with a tactile sense of a different sort perhaps, but which could be part of this logic I described in the case of pottery making. I hope that as I said, this is something for a practitioner to be able to properly relate to an answer. Yeah.
Just a follow-up. Would you then still use the term thinging to thing? Would you still use that
yes,
term?
I would. I think I have this discussion also with people that are into language more than the materials that I've talked with, and they still find the issue of this approach to thinking about language very, very useful. So yes, I don't see why you cannot. I think that it's more of thinking in terms of in an active terms, to put it this way, and embodied terms rather than abstract terms and immaterial terms. But there are different forms of materiality. I mean, some are obvious and familiar, others are not so familiar. But they remain material, and thus potentially can provide space for thinking, or what I describe by means of that.
Yeah, before coming to a closing question, I allow myself to ask one. I'm wondering, listening to you, wondering a lot of things, but one thing I'm wondering, listening to you, is how to develop a terminology. Of course, how to develop a conceptual frame, but also terminology, in order to to find a way, to find an effective way of dealing with this problem of duality. It was already in the definition of not in general, but in terms of the terms you are using, which was also the problem of the definition of affordances by Gibson, when they say, well, this is neither objective nor subjective, then what? Yeah. So, and I think so I believe to recognize different ways to address this in your lecture. I think there is a way which I believe it reinforces actually the duality, which is what I would say attributing human skills or capacities or agencies to non-human elements, like talking about material imagination, for example, or talking even about, which is really an interesting term, helonoetic consciousness. I'm guessing, and this will be my question, if there will be another way which can be focused on this idea of what you call the act of centering, and I could even say the process of centering. So to reinforce a third, yeah? So to reinforce a third which is neither the human nor the material, but is this very process, is also not an entity and not an objectual entity, is not but a process which could be the act of centering, or it could be also the process of sense making in an activist terms, as a confluency of agency, what you mentioned at the very beginning, this causal efficacy of matter and all the kinds of skills that, of human beings. So in referring to this third, maybe, and also emphasizing this third and trying to develop conceptual and terminological tools in order to outline this third. Maybe this would be a way to avoid continuing saying, well, this is this and this, or this is this, this is not this and this is not this. What is this? What is this then? So do we need a third to emphasize this third as a process of confluences of agencies? Do you think this could be a way?
Well, I'm definitely in favor of a process-oriented framework, whatever that might be, because the moment you prioritize process and becoming, in my view, you have solved half at least of your problems at the discursive level. Of course, those are problems for me and you, perhaps. They are not problems for the potters. I mean, those dualists are, our own, inventions and constructions and abstractions that we found useful, or not, to think about those issues, but they have no place in their own activities and practices. So, what I try to do is to learn from them. To find ways to just forget all those notions and categories and theories that we all of us, use to think and to relate to the world, and try to see if there is something in craft that can give you a new path, if you want, that you can follow to solve some of those issues. Yes, this is the big problem, right? I mean, I don't feel that we are going to solve it just like that. It's been around for decades, and perhaps it's a problem of language also, or of the categories that we use. We could think and we could use more relational vocabularies that could help. But as you said, I think the basic element from a discursive point of view is start with process. The moment you prioritize becoming over being, things will follow, things will flow in the right kind of direction. And then there is space for all the kind of conversation about what exactly categories or frameworks of classification or description you're going to use. That's a theoretical problem, but at least you are starting on a secure basis, because you start with process, you start with becoming. That in itself will protect you from those dualisms. That's my short answer.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much. Last question, as far as I know, goes to Alexander Damianish.
Yes, thank you very much for this really very, very interesting presentation. In the line of, in your title even, one has the feeling that this is talking about setting up a very self-sufficient entity of interaction between the material, the maker, and then the process happening in the thinking, which might be an interesting proposal regarding these socio-ecological situations we've just heard about, because this is something of sustainable relation, as it is explained there. But on the other side, it brings me to the question of the, how did I write it down, of mastering the unexpected in this context. Your very example is an example coming from the area of applied arts, so to say. If this differentiation somehow is of interest. But what about then the notion of untaming, so to say, the expected in these processes of material interaction, artistic practice?
Thank you. Well, I think that actually this invites the unexpected. This is all about chance, in a way, an accident, more than any other kind of thing. Although this is not always visible to the outsider, every creation is a new creation that has its own challenges. Things go wrong very often, and they can deal with the accident in very interesting ways. They can follow the accident, or they can resist and try to cover the accident, but it's always there. And the important thing for me is that, in my experience, they embrace it. So they enjoy the accident, and they try to make good use of it. It's exactly actually, I have this incident with in one of the interviews I did with one of the porters, that was making this contrast that for him, accident is everything. That will make him happy, and that will give me all kind of interesting possibilities for realization. And that is exactly the opposite of what will happen in an assembler's line of, let's say, producing Mercedes-Benz, where the accident is the only thing you don't want, really. Things need to happen the way they should. There is no place of accident there. Here, accident has this positive connotation, and it is integral to the creative process, in my view. Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you again, Lambros, so much for your answer. Thank you all for your questions. I think it's time to close this long session, not without, again, saying thank you so much, Alexander. Thank you so much for the Zentrum Fokus Forschung for hosting this project, and this symposium. Thank you also, Felipe Duque, Ernst Reiter-Meyer, and our cameraman, Viktor Jaschke, for avoiding accidents in this transmission, this streaming of this conference, of this lecture. And I will remind you here on site and you, wherever you are following us online, that tomorrow we will have a third Impulse lecture by Erin Manning. Erin will join us via Zoom because we decided to avoid transatlantic flights to realize this symposium. So she will join us at 4 p.m. Central European Time. You can come here and join us. You will be present, but via Zoom. And you could also follow it via YouTube. And I think that's all for now. Please join us tomorrow. And thank you very much for this fantastic evening. We can gather our time.